I know. I've got crazy hair going on, but you don't need to watch me. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the land of Israel and its history. I'm going to try to make this a brief lecture for you because there's plenty of material on this. Coogan does a much better job than I could possibly do, but I'll just wanted to review a few things for you and get you thinking about Israel's position in terms of where it is in the ancient Near East. So this lecture is entitled Geography and History of the Old Testament. If you see a full screen button, you're definitely going to want to full screen this button, this lecture, as much as possible, because it is important for you to be able to see it as best as you possibly can. Now, basics on geography of the ancient Near East, and I'll be referring to the land surrounding Israel as the ANE, or ancient Near East. Remember back to your very early education, probably somewhere in primary school or maybe in middle school, you may have had some introduction to what is called the Fertile Crescent. That is the bread belt of the Near East in the ancient world. And you can see it here. You've got these two rivers in contemporary where Iraq would be, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia. And then this crescent stretches over along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea and then goes down the Nile River. Great area for lands to be productive. And this is probably where culture arose, at least Western civilization arose, because this land, these rivers that flooded, the Tigris and Euphrates, and where they could build networks of canals, and in Egypt where the Nile flooded on a regular basis, provided the ancient world with bread, with grain, the possibility to have grain that you could store and you could feed large populations. And when you could feed large populations, you could begin to have people living together in larger towns and then eventually cities. And the word civis, the Latin word, is related to the word civilization, right? You had the development of civilization, people coming together in cities and not having to support themselves by hunting and gathering, but more because someone is able to grow more than they themselves can eat. And because of that, commerce and trade and others can specialize. We saw that actually in Jay's genealogy right after the Cain account, right, at the descendants of Cain, right, they become people who can work with metals. They become metalworkers. They become musicians. All these elements of civilization, right? Well, that was a new development, right? Several millennia ago, and it was still relatively new for the people of that time. And the reflection upon that is part of this land. All of this area is interconnected by roads, so there's trade and commerce, and it's relatively protected from the deserts here, so it's surrounded by desert, and so there's this intensive trade going back and forth and civilization going back and forth between these lands. Egypt, to review, depended upon the yearly Nile floods, ordered and dependable, extensive system of irrigation, great civilization down here to the south, secluded and safe from attack. The Mediterranean Sea here, desert here in Arabia, and desert here in Libya. Nothing really could penetrate the desert. Only in modern times, really only in the recent centuries, recent decade, a couple of decades, have we had the possibility of launching a war. When we launched the first Iraq war, it was from the desert. That would have been unthinkable in the ancient world. People would have died. You could not have transported water across the desert, but because of transport and modern machinery, we could do it. Rommel could do it in World War II, but prior to that, prior to mechanized warfare, that was impossible. So Egypt was safe from attack, and so you had the development of long dynasties and stable dynasties and kingdoms in Egypt. Mesopotamia was different. It was a rich and vast area, right? Abundant for agriculture. This is really where the development of civilization began, these early city-states in Mesopotamia. But you'll see it's exposed on many sides from invasion. You have mountains up here. You have mountains here. You could be invaded here from the south, safe here from the north, all around exposed. Home of the great empires that influenced the life of Israel, but there were many of them, and they turned over fairly rapidly during Egypt's life. In between this area, well, I won't talk too much about Asia Minor, but up here in Syria, Phoenicia, this was a wooded and wealthy area, harbors along the coast. This is where writing came from. The Phoenicians were the seafarers of the Mediterranean. They had ships. Well, look, they had wood. They had, great harvest, the cedars of Lebanon, so they had great forest, and they had harbors where they could safely keep ships, and that made them a seafaring nation. And so they went through the whole Mediterranean trading. They were very wealthy. That's where writing, we think, was developed because they could keep track. They needed to keep track of their goods, right? And so that's where writing spread then into the ancient Near East from that area. The alphabetic writing, anyway, spread from Syria, Phoenicia. There were other forms of writing in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, but they were not necessarily alphabetic. They were more hieroglyphic forms of writing, at least in Egypt, and then symbolic forms of writing up in Mesopotamia. Well, we won't talk about that. What we're really interested in is this area here, what you might call Palestine, Syria, or the Levant. This is the geographical focus. Now look at this. There's desert down here, and there's coast here. So you've got sea here, you've got the desert here. They're packed in. This is a packed-in shoreline country. And it's at the crossroads between these two great centers of civilization, Egypt up here, and what I'll call just Babylon up here, or the Mesopotamian kingdoms up here. And throughout Israel's history, either one or the other, either the southern nation or the northern nation, was somehow ascendant. And they would go back and forth fighting each other. And so that great deal of instability here in the Levant. And Israel's history then is uniquely tied to the great cultural centers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Very much the Levant, where the home of the people of Israel was an unstable place. Now, looking at the land itself, up here, side and entire, you've got, this is Lebanon, right? These are the Syro-Phoenicians. They have a harbor, but really there's no harbors, no natural harbors. Not until the Romans did they build Caesarea around here to have a harbor in this area. But otherwise, no natural harbor, so you couldn't have access to the sea. Like I said, there's desert over here. And really, you've got three parts of the land. The first is the coastal plain up here, fairly safe, divided into three parts: northern, southern, northern, middle, and southern. Acre, Sharon, and Philistia. Not really an important center for Israel's population, but there was a major road that went up here to Mesopotamia, between Egypt and Mesopotamia. That's how Pharaoh's armies would move if they were on the attack against the Egyptians. So that's the plain that's right off the coast. Really down here, that's where the Philistines were. This was, and now where the Palestinians are. This was really not Israel's territory in the ancient world. Now, Israel lived up here in the central hill country, the people. And in particular here in the southern part of the central hill country, where Jerusalem is the capital here, became the capital eventually, and you have the major cities in this area. This was the heart of where the people lived, and the people of Israel were hill people in a way. Their main industry was grazing of sheep, and a little bit of harvesting of grapes, figs for oil and olive oil, or olives for olive oil, figs for fruit. A very little bit richer agricultural area here in the north in Galilee. You could actually have some grain, fishing off the Sea of Galilee well into the Roman times. Pickled fish from the Sea of Galilee during Jesus' lifetime were transported throughout all the empire. And then down here, a little bit drier and more suited for sheep, small cattle, that kind of thing. So that's the central hill country where Israel lived. And then the Jordan is this depression where the Jordan River is coming from, up here, the Sea of Galilee, all the way into the Dead Sea. Some of the lowest points on earth in the Dead Sea. That Dead Sea is so low, in fact, that it's become a salt sea. It's sort of accumulated, and you can't even swim in it, really. You would just float if you try to swim in it. It's full of salt. And now it's actually very dry and desert area around that area. But in the time of David, we think this probably was more jungle-like. Jordan Cleft. And then the Transjordan Plateau. This is where some of Israel's kingdoms that were kind of friendly to Israel. You didn't necessarily. They did have battles with Moabites and Edomites and people up here in Gilead. But there was another highway that went through here, the so-called King's Highway, where also the Pharaoh could go back and forth. But good agricultural land here for grains and other things. So that's basically the geography of what we call the Levant. The Levant is a funny name. It's basically the name that Coogan uses and the name that I'll continue using for the land of Israel, okay, where Israel settled. Great civilizations up here in Mesopotamia. The first really major civilization is the Sumerians, the 3rd millennium. We have texts about them and great epics and myths, Gilgamesh and these other epics that you may be familiar with, some of the most ancient stories that we have that are written down among humanity. The Sumerians weren't necessarily organized as an empire. They had city-states, small city-states, and the idea was that the city-state was a given god's home, and the land belonged to the god, and the temple was the god's palace, and whoever was the head of the city-state, the head priest, was also somehow the head in charge, right, of the city-state. So again, when civilization developed, that's kind of how you had it. The Sumerians invented writing. It's the Akkadians who then later entered from the north, conquering the Sumerian area. They came up here from Mesopotamia. They took the Sumerian script, but then wrote in their own language, right? Sargon was really the first ruler in the 24th century. Seized power all over Sumeria and established the first empire. He coordinated these city-states in a governing structure, very, very powerful. In the south, you had this very stable old kingdom from the 2900 to 2400. This was the age of the pyramids and pharaohs, the golden age of Egypt. And the hieroglyphic inscriptions demonstrate that probably there was dominance of Israel as far north as Lebanon's. So the Egyptians dominated this area up to here. Very stable, very powerful period of Egypt's period. This first intermediate period between 21 and 2000, and Coogan talks about that, is a period of decline in Egyptian history. You have rival pharaohs, you have invasions, and also up here the Akkadian Empire falls during that period. Palestine is kind of in a time of crisis. You have invasions, you have cities of Palestine destroyed, some violently. We'll talk about how all this happens here. I've got some videos to watch about that, think about how this happened, and this is, we think, perhaps the time of the Exodus. The Exodus account somehow records what's going on when the people from Israel can flee up, and we think they probably settled into this area, conquered the city-states that were there, and began living in that period. We can talk about some ideas of whether Exodus and whether the story in Joshua reflects the truth and reality. But this is probably the period of the settlement after the period of Exodus. We're not sure, but that's kind of how we connect it there. Israel's formation period. Well, you know, it could be during that first intermediate period. It could be also maybe during the second intermediate period, late 13th and early 12th century. So some scholars say it's the first intermediate period around 2100, 22,000. Others think it's maybe later. And I think I misspoke if I said it was so early. Probably it's the second one, the late 13th, early 12th century, where Egyptian and Hittite Empire both collapse. That's probably the period in which you have the expansion of the monarchy, and probably that period sometime around 2000 is when, you know, you've got so it's very hazy, right? But basically, you know, this patriarchal period is in the prehistory, 2000 to 1700, and the national formation period must have occurred sometime around 1700 to 1000, during the Middle Kingdom or slightly after. We'll talk about all of that and how that works. I've got a nice video that'll clarify that. The main thing to keep in mind is that when Egypt and Babylon are in descendancy, that's when really Israel can flourish. When Egypt and Babylon to the north, when they're powerful, that's when Israel is struggling. So basically, you can look at these slides and try to figure out what's going on. The United Monarchy from 1000 to 922 with Saul and David and Solomon ruling. That is when Israel sort of emerges in the historical scene. And that's important to keep in mind. That's when we actually have the first records of Israel in extra-biblical accounts on different steles and different things like that. Then you have the period of the divided monarchy, which you have in basically 1st and 2nd Kings. And then you have the kingdom of Judah after the fall of Israel, and then eventually the temple, the exilic period, and the post-exilic period. Now these dates are important, and it's important to sort of know what's going on this right-hand side, where you've got different events that I've noted outside in Egypt and Israel. Coogan goes over this. Basically, the thing to keep in mind is that Israel's historical development, you've got the patriarchal period, which we're talking about in Genesis, we can't really tie that down very closely to any date. And this period of national formation in which Israel emerges out of Egypt with Moses, maybe during the 13th century, maybe later, that's all prehistory. You don't really have historical record outside of the Bible until around 1000 or 900, somewhere in there. That's when we can sort of reconstruct Saul and David and Solomon. So keep that in mind. And then you've got the divided history, and then you've got the fall of the two kingdoms. First, the kingdom of Israel, and then the kingdom of Judah in 586. So you have, and that's during a period of Assyrian and then Babylonian expansion. And then you have the exilic period, where Israel is taken away by the Babylonians up to Babylon, and then the return from 538 to 563. The course is going to cover all of this. But this slide is available for you, or these slides are available for you in a PowerPoint that you can download and take notes on and compare to Coogan. All of that is there for you if you want to read it in the course archives. I've got a tab for that where I have different PowerPoints and things. Just go over that as a review. But this was just to give you a sense for what the land was like and a basic sort of intro to the history. Coogan does a much better and more detailed job of it. But just to get you get your feet wet, more or less. All right, thank you, and I'll be seeing you again soon.